Thank you for putting together such a lovely workshop. I really enjoyed all the talks and hearing about everybody's perspective about the natural brain. And thank you for inviting me to also contribute to my point of view. Maybe before I dive into talking about honeybees, I'll just give you a slightly broader picture of the kind of questions that drive research in my lab. Being in computer science, we continuously talking about how humans communicate using technology like mobile connectivity. We pretty much just got totally used to being able to communicate with each other on large distances. This workshop is actually a very good example of that. But animals, of course, need to be able to communicate with each other using resources that they have in their nearby environment. And as I'm sure you all know and appreciate, there's a beautiful complexity of different model organisms or not model organisms that use different ways to communicate with each other: tactile communication, visual, chemical, vocal. And they not only evolved ways to communicate with each other just in pairs, they can also communicate with each other in very large groups. And that's where my interest really lies. There's many examples of this beautiful collective behavior, as we heard some glimpses of in this talk. I'm just going to highlight two that I think are maybe more relevant here. One is a slime mold. So that's the movie that I'm going to play here at the top right, which hopefully you can see. The slime mold is basically tracking food sources, which are all these white spots that is shown on the screen, and they direct other parts of their collective organism to the nearest food source. So in a sense, they kind of solve a physical computation problem of finding the shortest and most optimal path to food sources. And we heard a really nice talk about that already a few days ago in the art section, which I really enjoyed. And another really famous example is flocks of birds that I'm showing here on the movie on the right, at the bottom right. And these birds have been shown to use minimal communication with their nearest neighbors. In this case, it has been shown to be visual, to being able to make very quick decisions and move effectively and efficiently in these very large groups. The goal of what we're working on is to try to understand how animals communicate and how they do so through the environment. And I think this will become more clear once I go into some specific examples. But the question is, how do animals interact with their local environment that is only part of the big group in order to deal with environmental fluctuations while still being able to exchange energy and matter information with the macroscopic world. And the approach that we're using in my lab is a combination of mathematical and computational modeling and behavioral experiments. And this is where I should probably also give everybody a heads up to set up the expectations. I'm also not a neurobiologist. So we are sort of treating the animal as a black box that has input from the environment. Of course, the brain of this animal is going to do some really interesting and sophisticated computation. And then the output would be a behavioral output. So we kind of go back and forth between mathematical models and computational models of behavior and a set of behavioral experiments that I'll describe in this talk. And the model organisms that we use are insect swarms, which really push the envelope in terms of how many individuals we have in this group. And one of the model organisms that we work with in my lab is fireflies. And we already heard a really nice talk from Owen Martin, who is a graduate student in my lab earlier today in one of the Data Blitz sessions about how we're trying to understand firefly synchronization. If you haven't got a chance to watch it, I really recommend it. I believe it was recorded. And what I want to focus on today is the other part of my lab that works with honeybees. What I'm going to tell you about today are a couple of examples of how honeybees communicate through the environment. And that's a kind of a classical definition of the process that is usually termed stigmergy, of how animals communicate through the environment. So just so we're on the same page, one of the examples of these stigmergy processes is how ants communicate with each other when they're in large groups by laying pheromones in their foraging path. And the movie that you're seeing here is an ant where the nest is somewhere on the left side of this movie. On the right side, there is a sugar water drop, so that's kind of a food source. And then this ant found that food source, and then on the way back, it's touching its abdomen to the surface, which is highlighted by these red circles that hopefully you can see. And then a classic experiment that shows that ants indeed use this kind of communication through the environment by depositing information in the environment has been done, is illustrated over here. So that's basically a Y maze. They start from the nest and they need to get to the food source. And then they have to make a choice about which path to choose. Take the right turn, which would lead them to a longer route, or take the left turn that would lead them to a shorter route. And then in this really, really beautiful work, the researchers showed that the ants are able to actually find the shortest path by depositing these pheromones along the way. So that's one example of stigmergy. And what I'm going to show you today is very much built on this idea, but it's actually extending it a little bit in the sense that the ants, or in our case, the bees, will deposit information in a non-passive way. So it doesn't just, in this example, diffuse because of the laws of physics of diffusion. The individuals are actually also doing something active to change it. And they're going to use that using non-local physical fields of law and mechanics. So this is the outline for what I hope to be able to tell you about today. I'm going to tell you about how bees communicate through mechanical forces that they experience when they create these really large swarms. I'll also tell you about how honeybees ventilate their hive by sensing local temperature gradients. And I want to give a shout out just up front. So these two projects, the first two projects, are a project that I did during my postdoctoral studies at the Mahadevan Lab at Harvard, together with Jake Peters and Mary Salsado, who were graduate students there at the time. And then after I'm done with this, I'm going to tell you about a new project in my lab that still involves honeybees, and how they use airflows as well as chemical communication to find their queen. So that's the plan. And let me just dive into the first problem, which is the mechanical stability of reproductive swarms that honeybees create. So here is an example of a honeybee swarm that you see here on the left side. This is a feral swarm that we found not far away from our field station at Harvard. This is a behavior that occurs as part of the reproductive cycle of European honeybees. At some point, the colony size increases and they split into two parts. And then one part and a queen fly away and they hang like this from a tree branch. And this is a temporary structure. There's a lot of interesting aspects of this structure and how bees make decisions on how and where to create it that I won't have time to get into, but I'll have to give you a glimpse maybe at the Q&A session. But the point is that it's a temporary structure, and the bees don't have their more permanent nest structure to protect themselves from the elements. So they somehow must be able to adapt to environmental changes while they're in this temporary structure. And indeed they do. So there's a beautiful set of work from Tom Seeley that were then extended by my postdoctoral lab that show that honeybees swarms adapt to changes in the ambient temperature. So these are the pair of photos that I'm showing here at the top. On the right side, you see a swarm at cold ambient temperatures, and then at high ambient temperatures, the bees modulate density, dense. They also respond to rain that can, of course, also occur when they're in this structure, and they align themselves along the vertical line of gravity to create something that looks like a shingle-like structure that presumably makes the swarm less susceptible to water. And then at very high temperatures, it's been speculated by Bernd Heinrich that the bees create these channels that allows them to more efficiently exchange air from the inside warm swarm and the colder environment. So these are all really interesting and very complex processes of decision making, but underneath all of these, there is a mechanical problem. So something that is really important to emphasize here is that the bees are not flying; they're actually holding on to each other to create that structure. And because it's kind of like a living material, they have to adapt to processes that are arising from forces that they experience. So different shape of branches would result in different shape of the swarm because of static forces that are coming from gravity. But they can also experience more dynamical forces that are coming from wind. So in this movie here at the top right, I'm showing you a swarm on a windy day. It's going to get mechanically perturbed. That branch is going to be shaken. And then if it's being shaken too much and the bees actually, the swarm actually breaks and bees fall to the ground, if it happens during colder weather, the bees might not be able to warm up their flight muscles to be able to find their way back to the swarm, and they can die from hypothermia. So it sort of kills the thermoregulation purposes of these swarms if the mechanics is too extreme. So another really interesting point that I should make about these swarms is that they're really, really large. So there's tens of thousands of individuals that are creating each one of these swarms. And because of that, I think we can safely assume that a bee that is at one edge of the swarm can perhaps directly communicate with bees that are nearby, but it certainly cannot directly communicate with a bee that is at the completely other side of the swarm. And maintaining mechanical stability can actually sometimes demand this simultaneous coordination throughout the entire structure. Which is why it's really interesting to ask how do the bees maintain mechanical stability? So given everything I just told you about, what kind of local information could the bees be using to maintain the mechanical stability of the entire structure? Okay, so that was the question. And to address it, we worked with real honeybees at the Concord Field Station, which is not far away from Harvard. And I always like to note that this was my first venture to experimental studies. Until that point, I was sitting comfortably behind my computer screen doing models of biological systems. And this was the first time we actually tried to really work with living organisms, in this case bees. So of course, the setup that we constructed was somewhat frugal. And this is what I'm showing you here, the movie on the right. We had the swarm attached to a wooden board that is controlled by a motor. And then we record the shape of the swarm from several different angles. And the idea was quite simple. We just decided to shake the swarm and see what happens. And maybe from the response, we can learn something about the behavior of bees. So let me play this movie. This is a typical experiment. You can already probably see that the swarm is kind of wiggling at the tip, so it's not in exactly a solid structure. There's some elasticity there that will be important later on. Oops, let me stop this for a second. Let me go back here. Okay, so this is the gist of the results of the experiment. What I'm showing here is the front view at the top and then the bottom view. And we're shaking the bees left and right along the plane of this slide. And what you will see when I play these movies is that the bees change the shape of the swarm to adapt to the mechanical perturbation. So they start from a cone-like structure that has a certain height and base area. And hopefully, yeah, so here it's playing. Hopefully you can see it. So what happened here is that the cone basically got spread out. So the height decreased and the base area increased. And it's just playing in a loop here. And then once we stop the mechanical perturbation, the bees very slowly but surely go to their steady state. So that was actually a bit of a surprise. And we decided to study everything a little bit more systematically. So what you're seeing here at the top plot, the y-axis corresponds to the base area of the swarm, or the attachment surface where the bees are actually clinging to the wooden board as a function of time. And at the top plot here, this is the horizontal perturbation that I showed you before. The different colors correspond to different accelerations that we applied on the board. And as you can see, the higher the acceleration is, the more the swarm spreads out. But in contrast, when instead of shaking the bees horizontally, right and left, we're shaking the bees vertically, the swarm did not respond in the same way. It did not spread out. No matter how high, well, as high as the acceleration went. And actually, at some point in this movie that I'll show you an example of this, if the accelerations are too high, then the entire swarm can actually break. We didn't quite focus on these experimental conditions because it takes a long time to get the bees to form the swarm in the first place. But still, it was quite puzzling. Why do the bees respond to horizontal perturbation and not to vertical perturbation? So to try to answer that question, we turned to a mechanical model of the swarm. And we're actually going to take snapshots of the swarm at different aspect ratios along the spreading out process and study their mechanical properties. And the reason we do this is because the time scale in which we applied the mechanical perturbation, which is at the order of seconds or a fraction of a second, is of course much smaller than the time scale that it takes the bees to completely spread out, which is more like 15 or 30 minutes. Okay, so here are model of as the usual physics joke goes, spherical bees. These bees are going to be connected by elastic springs, and we include some excluded volume so that the bees don't completely overlap. We have gravity, and then we solve the equation of motion that also include a friction aspect term here, because we know that when we shake the bees, we shake the swarm once, they're not just going to swing forever. They're going to actually experience some friction and eventually stop the motion. Okay, and then what we're going to look at is a potential candidate for mechanical source of information that the bees could be using. And in this case, we decided to focus on the stretching of the bonds that the bees make to their nearest neighbors. So this is the geometrical definition, and then we're basically going to take the average of all the pairs of interaction that the bee has in this model. We're going to calculate what is the amount of stretching, and then take the geometrical average of that is highlighted here in red. Okay, so here's what the model is predicting. So for horizontal perturbation, sorry, by the way, I should say that this is a three-dimensional swarm. It's cut along the center, along the plane of this slide, so that we can see what's happening inside. And the colors correspond to shear, or the amount of stretching of the bones. So blue is low and yellow is high. So this is a movie showing us a swarm undergoing a horizontal perturbation. You can probably see that there's quite a lot of here close to the attachment surface. And if we take the same swarm, apply the same perturbation, just vertical, we can see that there is not a lot of stretching. And this is actually something that we, of course, also see in the experiments. So if we take a line of bees along the central position of the swarm and measure the deformation between consecutive lines or rows of the swarm, we can see that for horizontal perturbation, there's quite a lot of deformation in comparison to the vertical one. Okay. The model also predicts some aspects of how the effect of aspect ratio would affect the mechanical perturbation the swarm would experience. So here at the top, this is the same movie from the previous slide of an elongated swarm, and I want to compare it now to a spread out swarm after the spreading process. And again, there's quite a sharp distance between the amount of stretching of bonds in the elongated case in comparison to the spread out swarm. And again, this is something that we can see happening in the experiments. So if we follow bees along these different lines that I'm highlighting here at different colors, and follow what they do as a function of time, which is what I'm showing you here right beneath this plot, we can see that for elongated swarms, there's going to be quite a lot of deformation in comparison to a spread out swarm. So it seems like this could be a good candidate for a mechanical source of information the bees could be using to stabilize the structure. It would explain why the bees don't respond to vertical perturbation in comparison to horizontal one. Also, it would explain why the bees would stop at a certain aspect ratio once the swarm is spread enough to minimize these mechanical forces. And so then just to, as a proof of concept, we plugged all of this information into an agent-based model where now the bees can actually sense the mechanical forces that they are experiencing between the bonds that they make to their neighbors. And we integrated over one period of perturbation, where one period would be basically one shake to the right, one shake to the left, and similar for up and down. And what I'm showing you here is the sum of that signal that is represented by the color scale here. Blue again is low, yellow is high for a horizontal swarm, as well as vertical, vertically shaking swarm. So you can already see that there is a more of that signal happening for a swarm that is being shaken horizontally. So that could potentially be enough to explain what the bees are doing and what all we need to do in this agent-based simulation. However, we also need to tell the bees where to go. So potentially, they can decide based on the signal that now this signal is too high, so something is really going on, we're really being shaken. What should the bee do? Where should this bee move? And we know from the experiments that the bees move upwards, which would lead to the spreading of the swarm. But we were not so sure that bees that are inside a very dense and shaky environment would have the sense of where upwards is. So we decided to implement the different condition just for this proof of concept, where the bees follow local gradients of this mechanical signal. And these gradients are shown in little little black arrows that hopefully you can see, but if not, they're pointing upwards and a little bit to the sides. So that's how we implemented the simulation, and perhaps not surprisingly, it works. So for a swarm that is shaking horizontally, we can see that the bees do spread out just based on the local information that we defined, and not so much for the vertical case. Okay, so the takeaways from that part of the talk are that showed you that honeybee swarms regulate the shape of their swarm to become less susceptible to mechanical perturbations. They're sensitive to a balance like frequency or accelerations, forces, and the directionality of the signal. And what we think is going on is that the bees modulate the aspect ratio to minimize their local deformation. But to tie it back into the idea of the extension of classical stigmergy, here bees potentially found a way to sample the mechanical forces locally in this really massive structure, and harness these fields, large fields of elasticity, to stabilize the swarm. Okay, so that's it about mechanical communication, and now I want to move to talk to you about sensing temperatures and airflows that helps bees ventilate their hive. Okay, so there's many examples of social insects that actually build their nests in a way that helps them thermoregulate. Examples of these are termite mounds, ant mounds, but honeybees, at least in this part of the world, tend to nest in pre-existing cavities, which tend to be tree cavities that definitely have some characteristics that the bees are trying to optimize, like the size of the cavity and the entrance size and so on. But the point is that they're really using existing structures, and they have to do something more active to ventilate their hive. So it turns out that bees solve that problem by fanning at the entrance of the hive. On the movie here on the left, I'm showing you a single bee that is fanning. There is a red marker that follow one of the air vortices. So you can see that it's driving air backwards along its body axis. But of course, if one bee does this, because it's so small relative to the size of the hive or nest, nothing really is going to happen. So bees actually tend to do this in groups. So there's a group of bees that are fanning at the entrance of the hive, and that helps them to establish a stronger airflow and exchange air from the hot interior of the hive and the colder environment. And there's a couple of challenges of this process, which we studied with commercial beekeeping hives. So these are Langstroth hives. And for those who are not familiar, these are really just wooden boxes that have a very, very narrow slit. And this is what we're seeing here at the picture at the top. It also has this wooden extension that beekeepers call the porch. So the bees basically just stand on the porch and fan their hive. And the challenges that occur during this process, one is related to fluid friction. So let's say that we have a group of bees that are fanning at one side of the entrance. There's going to be opposing airflow that is coming due to the conservation of mass. So we'll have an interface between opposing flow, and every time we have an interface between opposing flows, we're going to lose some energy due to friction. The second challenge, which we term as antagonism, very loosely defined, is that if we imagine that scenario where we have bees centered around or grouped around one side of the entrance, drawing air outside, then again, because of conservation of mass, is going to be opposing airflow coming in from the other side of the entrance. But then if suddenly some bees would decide to stand over here at that other side and fan, then they would create opposing airflows and sort of fight the airflow that the first group of bees is creating. So again, we're going to lose some energy due to that as well. Okay, so here the question is, how do the bees coordinate their fanning response in order to minimize friction and energy loss? And again, we're kind of looking for local sources of information that the bees could be using to coordinate this process. Okay, so these experiments were done by years. My contribution here was purely for the mathematical modeling. And the experiments that Jake started with were, as I'm going to show you in this movie, so we're now looking at the entrance from the top. There's a bunch of bees here on the right side that are fanning. And what Jake is doing is taking a temperature measurement device as well as a airflow measurement device and just measuring these numbers throughout the entrance. These experiments were quite informative because they showed us that the positions of the bees that are fanning along the entrance, as well as the air velocity, as well as the temperature, the local temperature, are all coupled. So this is what we're seeing in the plot over here. And all of these three quantities are plotted as a function along the entrance of the swarm. Sorry, the entrance of the hive. So to understand better that process and how bees might be using local physical signals from the environment to coordinate their aggregation, we formulated a mathematical model. As I mentioned, the entrance is very, very narrow and long, so we treat it as a one-dimensional entity in space. And we're going to follow three properties that are related to that process. One is the density of bees that are fanning, the local temperature at the entrance, and then also the air velocity. And we're going to make a couple of assumptions. One is that bees fan air outside of the hive. And we know that because we know when the bees fan, they drive air backwards. And we know from the recordings, the movies, that the bees face towards the entrance of the hive. Second, bees are more likely to fan at high temperatures. And this is based, on measurements that were done by Mike Breed and Chelsea Cook. And they measure the probability of bees to start fanning as a function of the ambient temperature, showing that there's this on and off rates with a specific temperature that is a threshold that triggers that behavior. Third is conservation of volume that I already mentioned. So for any cube of air that comes out of the hive, there's going to have to be a cube of air coming into the hive to conserve the volume. And then finally, velocity gradients in core friction, which I already mentioned a few slides ago. So these are all the assumptions in words. And now I'm going to put this in mathematical form. So we have a couple of equations. The first one is coupling the density of bees that are fanning to the on-off rate that depends on the local temperature along the entrance of the hive. The second is Newton's law of cooling that tells us what would be the temperature given a temperature gradient. And then finally, we have an equation that couples the air velocity to the conservation of volume, as well as the friction that will occur when we have opposing flows. So these are the equations, and we can solve them numerically, which is what I'm showing you here. This is an example of a solution to these equations as a function of time. The y-axis here is the position along the entrance. The x-axis is the time. And the color corresponds to the density of bees that are fanning. Start from some kind of a random distribution, and very quickly the bees organize into two clusters of fanning bees. And at some point, one of these clusters disappears, sort of being absorbed by the other cluster. And the end result is one big cluster that is positioned at one end of the entrance. We can do some sanity checks. For example, do we actually get minimal friction during this process, which is, so the friction is being shown here in blue as a function of time. We can see that the friction is reduced as the number of clusters is and their size is increasing, which is shown in red. So that is just a sanity check. But we can actually use that model to make some long time scale predictions for the dynamics of these clusters. I'm showing here 3 examples. On the left side, this is an area with cold ambient temperature of 25 Celsius. And you can see that there is a cluster that is being formed, and that cluster sort of fluctuates along the entrance to the hive. At intermediate ambient temperatures that I'm showing here at the middle, we still get a cluster that is fluctuating, but it tends to cling more to the sides of this simulation box. And then at really high temperatures, which I'm showing here on the right side, there's no cluster forming because it's getting really hard to distinguish between the temperature inside the hive and outside the hive. Okay, so with these predictions, Jake designed a really nice setup where he positioned temperature measurement devices that look like these little droplets here in the zoom in set. And let me play this. So this is how it looks like when the bees are fanning. So these temperature measurement devices are positioned just high enough so that they don't touch the wings of the bees. And we're seeing some really interesting trends that I want to show you here at the plots at the bottom of the page. So what you see here is a recording of 3 consecutive days. The top plot is showing the ambient temperature, so you can kind of see the day-night cycle of these 3 days. And then the bottom plot is showing us the temperature at the entrance, and wherever we see this high temperature, that's a good proxy for where the bees are positioned, because we know from the previous experiments that the position of the bees and the temperature is coupled. So a few trends that are consistent with our mathematical modeling is that at low ambient temperatures, we have a cluster of bees that are fanning, and it fluctuates. The position of that cluster fluctuates along the entrance. And then at higher ambient temperatures, we get a cluster that is clinging, is fluctuating less and clinging to one of the sides. Okay, so takeaways from that part, I showed you that bees cluster at the entrance of their commercial hive, and they do this to create a global airflow that helps them ventilate their hive. And what we think is going on is that bees are able to sense the temperature, the local temperature at the entrance, and use that as an information source to coordinate their clustering. And to tie this back to the bigger picture of the extension of stigmergy that I mentioned before, here we have an example where bees harness fluid dynamics, again, of non-local fields. So it's a fluid dynamics that is kind of coupled throughout the entire hive in order to process, in this case, an efficient nest ventilation. Okay, so I'll move to the last example that I want to tell you about. And so far, everything, all the other 2 examples that I told you about, we're already assuming that the bees are in a coherent swarm or in a coherent colony. And the question is, how do the bees find a way to these aggregate and dense environments in the first place? We know that bees use pheromones, chemical communication, to identify the queen. But these pheromones, of course, decay very rapidly in time and space. So keep this in mind when I play the next movie. So here again, we have a commercial beehive, and the queen of this hive is already inside the box. But we positioned the rest of the worker bees further away from the entrance. And somehow the bees, this is of course sped up, but I think it illustrates the point that somehow the bees really know where to go, and they manage to find the way into the hive. And if we zoom in to the entrance, we can see that there's a lot of bees that are, of course, fanning. You can hopefully see that, but they're also positioning their abdomen upwards. A close-up how that look like. When they push their abdomen upwards, they expose a pheromone gland. It's called the Nasonov gland. And when they fan their wings, they drive airflow on top of that gland and potentially moving these pheromone backwards. We already know from other systems that I mentioned before, like in social amoeba, that it can be quite an efficient process to generate and sense the same chemical to facilitate aggregation. But really, the trick that the bees are using here is the airflow. So here on the left, I'm showing a movie from Peters et al. From a couple of years ago, showing a bee that is scenting. So that's the technical jargon for that behavior, scenting. Because the bees use airflow, they don't just passively release these pheromones, they are also directing them in a specific direction that is defined by their body axis. We notice anecdotally that bees that are getting close to the queen, instead of just moving all the way to the queen, would position themselves at a certain distance and then start scenting. And then other bees that come from behind will do the same thing. So there's this network of activation. But we still didn't know how do bees decide when to perform this action, and how do these decisions actually affect the aggregation process. And the approach, like before, is going to be a combination of behavioral experiments and mathematical modeling. So the behavioral experiments were led by Dumai, who is a graduate student in my lab. She's one of the first graduate students in my lab. And she designed this really nice experimental arena where the bees and the queen are confined into a semi-two-dimensional environment. We have a camera at the top that gives us aerial view of what's going on. And everything is backlit so that we have a better contrast between the bees and the background, so which will be important for analysis. Okay, so this is how a typical experiment would look like. We have the queen in a little cage positioned at one corner of the experimental arena, and the rest of the worker bees at the furthest corner in the arena. And this is again sped up. We can see that there's a lot going on here. The bees are, for those of you with really sharp eyes, you might be able to see that the bees are scenting. And then if I scroll forward, we can see that at the end, the bees find their way to the queen and they aggregate around the queen. So we wanted to have a more quantitative analysis of these experiments. It's really hard to just and very it takes a very long time to just manually track bees that are scenting or non-scenting. So together with our collaborators, Greg Stephens at Wijai in Okinawa, and his postdoc Keisha, who is now opened her own lab in Germany, we constructed a high throughput analysis code that is based on machine learning. And I won't go into the details, but I would just say that at the end result was an output of where the bee is whether it's scenting or not, and then it also gives us the orientation of the bee, which is important because it tells us in which direction the pheromones are being directed to. So here is the same movie that I showed you before, but now with the analysis. So every time you see an arrow, that's an arrow that is pointing out to the direction of, so that's a bee that is scenting, and the arrow is pointing out to the direction in which the pheromones are being propagated to. And we can visually see that there's a sharp increase in the number of bees that are scenting. And we can also sort of see that there's a line of sight here, but it's sort of hard to say by eye. So do the directions of these scenting events actually kind of global map that leads the bees? The answer I'll show you in a few slides, but to try to answer that question, we took all of these scenting events, and here I'm just showing you an illustration of, let's say that this is one frame from our movie, and all of these black arrows are the directions in which the bees are scenting. So if we take all of these arrows and treat them as local gradients on a higher dimensional surface, and we do this surface reconstruction, then potentially high areas on the surface should correspond to where the queen is. And the rest of the bees would sort of climb up the surface. So here is an example of this surface reconstruction for one of the experiments. The color scheme is blue for low values, and yellow are high values on the surface. And when we were constructing it instantaneously, we can sort of see that there is a tendency to have yellow at the upper right corner, but it's quite noisy. So actually, if we take the average of all of these surfaces, we can see that we get a nice correlation between high values of the surface and where the queen is. So it does seem like the bees are creating these scenting events to potentially formulate a global map that leads to the position of the queen. And here, this is just some characterization of the mutual information between the position of the queen and the surface. The point is that if we take random directions, for example, of the scenting, then we get a very flat surface. So it doesn't lead anywhere, but what the bees are, the way the bees are scenting actually does lead to the queen. Okay, so last thing to try to understand here is what might be triggering scenting. What would be local cues that the bees get from the environment to decide to scent? And we get a few hints about this from the experiments. The first one is shown here, is that there is likely a probabilistic triggering of scenting. And the reason I'm saying that is when we plot the number of scenting bees, which is the y-axis, versus time, and the different shade of green here corresponds to different number of bees that we have in our experimental arena, we see that it's proportional. So a fraction of the bees is going to be bees that are scenting. The other hint we're getting from the experiments is that there seems to be a consistent distance between bees that are scenting. What I'm showing you here is an analysis of the positions of all the bees that are scenting. We can measure their distance to their neighboring bees that are scenting, and plot that on the y-axis as a function of the number of bees that we have in the experimental arena. And besides one outlier, we get a consistent value of about 6 centimeters. So if the bees are using pheromones that decay at a particular construction using physics of diffusion, then we know that a certain distance from the source would always have a consistent concentration of pheromones. So maybe they're actually being triggered by that consistent concentration of pheromones. So these are the two hints that we got from the experiments. And next, we're going to use these hints to construct, again, an agent-based model that captured the process. And we're going to do that to understand better the behavioral decisions that bees can make of the model. Okay, so we constructed a model where we have agents that can move in a two-dimensional arena. They can, when they do stop to send, they can do so either in an isotropic way. Oops, why did this movie not play? Huh, I don't know. Okay, let me just skip these movies, but hopefully you get the idea from the snapshot here. Isotropic would be the same amount of propagation in all directions, and then when we have a directed diffusion, which we think is what the bees are doing, then we get this diffusion that, profile of the plume that is skewed in one direction. Okay, and this is the scheme of the simulation. So we have a simulation box. Our bees can start by performing a random walk. And then they can make a probabilistic decision whether to send once they reach the threshold that triggers that behavior. Or they can move up the gradient of a pheromone concentration that is supposedly leading them to the queen. So these are the elements of the model. And we found a couple of interesting things when we plot the results as a function of the behavioral parameters that we think the bees might be able to change. The first one on the y-axis is the threshold concentration that triggers their scenting behavior. And the second one is on the x-axis is a directional bias. So 0 would be a situation where the bees don't fan at all. High values would correspond to fanning. And there could also be, of course, a gradient there. Okay. So at high values of directional bias and threshold concentration, nothing happens because the threshold is so high that none of the bees are sending. Okay, excuse me. When these two values are very low, the bees tend to get stuck in small clusters that are very hard to get out of. So it's kind of like a local equilibrium state. At intermediate values, we sometimes see diffusion limited aggregation, which scales really badly with the size of the system. And then there is this sweet spot that only occurs when we have a non-zero directional bias, and we refer to this as clustering via percolation. And here is a movie from that simulation. So the information, excuse me, is propagating throughout the entire system, and the bees are actually able to reach one large cluster around the queen. Okay, so the takeaway from that last example that I hope I was able to show is that the local position and directions of the sending events integrate into a global map that leads the bees to the queen. And using directional signaling opposed to isotropic signaling can actually be beneficial in avoiding a local equilibrium, like, for example, situations where the bees would create very, very large number of small clusters, which is not ideal. Okay, so I showed you a couple of examples of how bees use mechanical signals to stabilize their swarm structures, potentially sampling thermal gradients to ventilate their hive, chemical concentrations to find their position to the queen. So I hope I was able to convey that honeybees are a really interesting model system to try to understand communication through the environment, and specifically how they might be harnessing non-local physical fields of, in these examples, flow and mechanics. Okay, so with that, I want to acknowledge all of our collaborators. Over here, there's a picture of my new lab, my new little swarm, and on the right side, sources of funding. And thank you all very much for your attention. Hopefully you heard my talk, can't really say, and I'll be happy to take any questions.